And we're live. It is Thursday, February 27th, the year of our Lord 2025, or at least the year of some of our lords, because for some people we have replaced, the Lord with a gleaming icon statue of Donald Trump. It is 8 o'clock a.m., and all of our hosts and guests are today in the same time zone, so we don't have to talk about what other time zones may be affected. And I know what you're thinking this morning. You're thinking, why is Ben not wearing a dog shirt? And there's an answer to that question. And it is because I woke up this morning and I said it's not a dog shirt day. Even though it is dog shirt daily, even though this is dog shirt TV, every now and then there are days that are not dog shirt days. And so I pulled out what we call in the Wittes household the shirt with 10,000 holes. And there's actually two shirts with 10,000 holes. One is this one, and one is a kind of pale teal colored. And I bought them both when I was 21 years old. I am now 55, because I was going bicycling around the South Island of New Zealand, and I needed shirts that were not made of cotton, kind of bicycling clothes. And these shirts, as you can see, have a lot of holes in them, little pinprick holes, and they are, as I have learned over the preceding 34 years, completely indestructible. And when my children were little, they used to wear them as kind of nightgowns. And it was like a special thing. Can we wear the shirt with 10,000 holes as like bedclothes? And they have lived with me since for 34 years. They have been with me longer than I've been married, which is very unlike, I got married when I was 22. So, the shirts with 10,000 holes every day, every so often you just wake up and you say, I am about to go on a show to talk about North Koreans in Ukraine and maybe talk about, impeachment of South Korean presidents and maybe talk about the U.S. relationship with the Korean Peninsula with respect to Donald Trump. Gonna mix it up today. Not gonna wear a dog shirt. Gonna wear one of the two shirts with 10,000 holes. And so I did. I put it on, and I felt that I owed you an explanation, because it is dog shirt TV, not shirt with 10,000 holes TV. And I thought to myself, if you're going to do that, you need to give an explanation. And so that is all the explanation that you're going to get. Live with it. Shirt with 10,000 holes. There is another one. Maybe I'll wear that someday. And you can be the person to remember, oh, that is the pale teal colored shirt with 10,000 holes as opposed to the dark blue one. And the sun is not shining today. The birds are chirping. It is going to be a great freaking day. And the reason is that you are watching Dog Shirt TV. And it is a freaking revolution in morning television. And one of the revolutionary features is that I can sit here talking about a 34-year-old shirt while two distinguished scholars look on and say, how did my choices in life cause me to end up listening to this absolute nonsense ranting? And why are hundreds of people going to watch this and think that this is a good use of their time? But here's the answer, because that is life. It is a Carnegie Corner day. We're not allowed to have fun anymore, but we are allowed to have Darcie Draught, whose name I am informed is pronounced as though there will be no rain, although it looks like there will be rain. So, Alicia, introduce our Carnegie Corner guest today.
First, I need to know, is your shirt with 1,000 holes a metaphor for recruiting malnourished North Korean soldiers to fight in
Well,
a foreign war?
there is no doubt that the shirt with 10,000 holes, since there were 10,000 roughly North Korean troops fighting in Ukraine, um, is a metaphor for something. And one of the cool things about the shirts with 10,000 holes is that the metaphor is almost infinitely adaptable. So we could describe the shirt with 10,000 holes as the Trump administration, the second Trump administration, where there is this diabolical evil plan that includes invading your country, but it's got 10,000 holes in it. And so, it, like, for example, the shirt with 10,000 holes, one thing it does not do is keep you warm. And one thing the Trump administration doesn't seem to do is to be able to get very much done. And so you can think of it as a metaphor for North Koreans in Ukraine. You can think of it as a metaphor for almost anything you like, anything that's solid but isn't solid.
Okay. That makes that makes total sense. You
Yeah,
can't make me laugh
I'm
today because my computer will shake. I'm holed up somewhere. Clearly, I'm under duress with this kind of a background, and the internet is poopy. So I will try to be quiet. But let's come back to Carnegie Corner because I love this feature of the show. Today we have my colleague Darcie Draught. I shared a link. She's actually got pronunciations for both her last names, which I love.
Wait, what's the
Darcie
other last name?
I have a
Vihares.
double-barreled Bejarez. Yeah. Yeah. I married a Chilean, so now I have two very hard to pronounce last names.
Well, take it from a Wittis, which looks the Wittis is great because it looks like nobody thinks they don't know how to pronounce it, but everybody gets it wrong, and
Well,
so it's perfect that way. You nobody asks.
Both my names are mispronounced widely.
Really?
Um, yes, yeah, Wanless. It's very seldom said Wanless. I get Waneless, Wanless, so many variations on a theme. But this is about Darcie. Darcie's going to tell us cool things. So, Darcie is an expert on South and North Korean domestic policies and foreign policies, as well as Northeastern Asian relations and a host of other things. Of the many areas she's been looking at, and she's lived in Korea, we could talk about soju and all of the other things that we could drink in Korea, but we're not. And so recently
Not
she's been
yet.
looking into, not yet, looking into the recruitment of North Korean soldiers in Ukraine, which I think is a topic near and dear to your heart, Ben. Darcie, why don't you start out by telling us a little bit about your research, how you got into this in the first place?
yeah. So as you mentioned, I cover the entire Korean Peninsula, North and South Korea. And I look at their relations with each other as well as their relations to big powers like the United States, China, and Russia. A big part of I mean, I'm trained as a political scientist. I, took a detour into academia for a while. And I
So
looked
sorry.
at, for better or worse, but now I'm here, but in the think tank world. And I'm really interested in political economy, institutions, and social networks and how those affect policy change. Now that's a little bit easier to do for South Korea than North Korea. So a lot of my, data-driven research or like original research is really focusing on South Korea these days. I'm writing a book now on South Korea's industrial policy as a form of foreign policy, highlighting the role of big companies like Samsung, LG, Hanwha. Hanwha is a big shipbuilder that many people maybe not know about, but actually is moving a lot of the stuff that we need around the world. So I'm looking at South Korean foreign policy a lot, but I also do pay close attention to what's going on in North Korea. I mean, it's an issue that I've been following for, I guess, before Kim Jong Un came to power. So over almost 15 years now. As Alicia mentioned, I moved to South Korea in 2008, and I lived there for 5 years, including doing a master's there. So I kind of learned about Korea from Korea initially, and I think that changes how I think about the region. But yeah, so I follow North Korean politics as much as possible. Data is a bit of a hard time, a bit of a problem. And so I look to the people that I can rely on, journalists, diplomats, NGO workers that go to North Korea or work with North Koreans. And that's where a lot of our information about North Korea's role in Ukraine is coming from today.
And let's start with something super basic that I confess I don't myself understand the answer to, which is why is it in Kim Jong Un's interests to send 10,000 North Koreans to be slaughtered and captured um, in Russia? What is he getting out of this?
Yeah, I mean, as we know right now, it's pretty brutal what's happening to a lot of the North Korean soldiers that have been deployed to Ukraine. And in addition to the thousand plus that have reports really vary, but the couple thousand that have been sent to Ukraine, 10,000 more have been sent to Russia to help with training and things like that. But I think right now what it really speaks to is North Korea. One, it feels like it needs to diversify its diplomatic profile. It's heavily reliant on China, both diplomatically and from a security perspective and economically. And the last part is particularly important right now. China and North Korea trade accounts for 98% of North Korea's economic relations with the outside world. And this is really important considering the fact that North Korea is virtually cut off from the international economic system.
And when you say 98%, do you mean 98% of the public illicit trade, or does that
Right,
also
right.
include all the
Yeah.
organized crime that they do?
Yeah, that's a hard thing to figure. I mean, it's right now that captures what this is South Korean uh the South Koreans have really great information on this. This is their numbers, the official numbers from there. It's hard to kind of capture what the illicit trade looks like. That's all. I mean, that's like a whole other thing that we can get into is the illicit trade networks that involves complicated shipping networks that circumvent international
Robbing
ports.
Bangladeshi banks. I
Crypto,
mean,
yeah, yes, yes. The cyber aspect of currency, of getting, of raising currency in North Korea is huge and not to be underestimated. In fact, it's really quite formidable and something that's a whole other conversation. But this is trading goods, including energy, which is also a really important thing because North Korea is pretty energy poor, so it needs to import, oil, coal from China as well. And so, and this is a country that does still have lots of widespread blackouts. So that's what that number is capturing. The illicit stuff. I mean, everything that's also like counterfeit goods. Like there's been they have big schemes to have counterfeit cigarette trade, all of these sorts of things. That's not necessarily captured in those numbers.
sorry, you were saying before I cut you off
Yeah.
about what was captured in those numbers.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So just like major consumer goods, industrial goods, raw materials for building North Korean industry. I mean, it is worth noting at this point that Kim Jong-un has made a concerted effort to build up his domestic industrial base. Whether that's being successful is still, I think, to be seen. It's a really closed off country. And so to get back to your original point about why does it need to send troops to Russia, it's really as a way to diversify, certainly its international partnerships. North Korea and Russia last year in the summer, they signed and then ratified in the fall a renewed treaty, a mutual defense treaty that really is re-upping a lot of the Soviet era, like the Cold War, 20th century Cold War era of Soviet backing of North Korea and the peninsula. And it's pretty remarkable because for most of the 21st century, it's been the North Korea-China relationship that has been the strongest. And so now we see North Korea going to Moscow, going to Putin, and we know now that it really was actually Kim Jong-un that offered to do this. It wasn't that Putin came to North Korea. North Korea offered to do this. And so in a sense, we might be able to, assume that Kim Jong-un saw Putin being also diplomatically isolated, number one. I mean, but number two, more importantly, North Korea had something that Putin needed, and that was soldiers and munitions, right? Because North Korea is still a war economy, and they have vast supplies of munitions and different sorts of weapons capabilities that it actually has supplied for warfighting in the Ukraine war.
And there's another Korea that has a lot of defense industrial capacity, in fact, more then, although it's not going to send troops, the South Koreans have were already supplying the Ukrainians to some degree and do seem to have ramped up a bit in response to this. Why why does South Korea, I mean, God bless them for doing it, but why do they react to North Korea's decision to project force overseas by saying, okay, it's like, this is like El Salvador, you come, or Angola, you come in on one side, we'll come in on the other. It seems like an odd proxy war for South Korea.
Um, yeah, I mean, I think like certainly South Korea has its own capacity questions, its own questions about the legality around sending different sorts of aid to a foreign conflict that did restrict some things. But I think the very fact that, I mean, one, South Korea is still at a state of war with North Korea. I think that's really important to remember. The Korean War, the kinetic part of it was 1950 to 1953, and so that's the same amount of period that the Ukraine War has now been going on, right? It's a 3-year war. What happened though is there was an armistice signed at that point, and we're still technically at a state of war. So South Korea is also needs to prepare for the event of any kind of contingency on the Korean Peninsula. So the very fact that North Korea is active in another conflict is of interest to South Korea at a strategic level. It's also important because, and I've written about this, I wrote a blog piece for Carnegie back in the fall. This is, I think, an interesting proxy war for what was the OG proxy war of the Cold War, or one of them, the earliest one probably, the Korean Peninsula. We have North Korean soldiers and their weapon systems that have not been tested in battle, right? They've been testing, testing them on the peninsula in their territory. They've been doing some live fires off the coast, but they've never tested them in battle, much less the soldiers have had battlefield experience. And now we have North Korea sending its soldiers and sending its weapon systems to aid a conflict in another part of the world. Well, South Korea is definitely going to be interested because now they're seeing their adversary getting battlefield experience. So what does that look like? And so there's a lot of different implications, like tactically, I think lessons learned that the South Koreans want to learn from. But then there's also this bigger question that is important, is it also came at a moment. South Korea's response is, I think, also indicative of the leadership in Seoul at the time. So now President Yoon Suk-yeol, who is in the process of being likely impeached, it's likely to be upheld. He, during his term, when he came into office in 2022, he really made a very, one, to reset the U.S.-ROK alliance, the U.S.-South Korea alliance, to make it very strong, to deter North Korea. That's a very big conservative Korean policy, strategic outlook. And then two, he was really, I think, bullish on joining what we would think is like Western sorts of blocks. So that's everything from, he had a pitch to join an expanded G7, to include a G8 with Korea, South Korea, to lots of sidelines with NATO. And so he was much more, I think, foreign leaning than perhaps another politician would be. So I think that the leadership in particular made a difference in how South Korea responded.
So I see Kim Jong-un maybe yesterday or today just was saying how they need to prepare a modern army. He was visiting, I guess, the military academy or something. So how much of that is an admission from him of maybe what his next steps will be? And it does seem to tie back, and he does seem to be mentioning this about sending troops to Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, that's hard. I mean, these sorts of Kim Jong-un and his father and grandfather, the on-the-spot guidance sites, kinds of visits to either military sites, military academies, missile tests, factories, all those kinds of on-the-spot guidance. Like, there's a kind of a pattern to them. So I think that, one, for people that watch North Korea for a long time, it's really to see like what's the narrative over time rather than like a particular snapshot. It's unless it's like a big event like the Workers' Party, the annual worker, something like that, that's marking a particular, big policy change. These on the spot arrays they're helpful in seeing like kind of the longitudinal patterns in what the narrative is. So I do kind of want to caveat that because it's really easy for North Korea to pick up on like individual things of North Korea. I mean, I'm thinking about like, especially during the Fire and Fury era, or if you listen to the kind of really vitriolic language from Kim Jong-un's sister, who has really like harsh words to say about basically everybody. If you just take one point, then it seems really, outstanding. But it's really is a bigger pattern, and thinking about in this like narrative system of a country that still has like quite a propaganda machine when it comes to security planning. So I do want to caveat that, but at the same time, again, to go back to my earlier thesis that North Korea is a wartime economy, right? Kim Jong-un, early when he came into power in 2011, shortly after, he initiated this plan called Byungjin dual track policy. That's what it translates at, like kind of dual track, simultaneous development of nuclear weapons and economic development. And I think that's really particularly significant because it put those two on par with each other, that the country is going to be one. And we know now that it has a demonstrated nuclear capability. The delivery system reentry is a bit spotty, but it still is, a formidable nuclear power from the perspective of, destabilizing the anti-proliferation regime, etc., and American extended deterrence. And then the second thing is the economic development. These are on par footing, and they really do feed to each other. So you can see how the economy is really geared toward building up its warfighting capability in multiple domains, not just nuclear, but also conventional. And it really is also important to say that North Korea's conventional technologies are really quite out of date. I mean, it's using mostly Soviet inspired, if not exact, like Soviet assets from, the 70s. And we know now that, in part of it, this treaty that North Korea and Russia has for the past almost year now, that Russia has been sending more of its fighter jets to North Korea, but they're from, again, the Soviet era. These are really outdated. So on the one hand, yes, they're getting more numbers in the form of their Air Force fleet in particular is, I think, important considering this type of theater that North Korea, that the inter-Korean conflict might be. But these are still like way behind certainly the United States capabilities, but also South Korea, which has some of the most advanced indigenous fighter jets of its own, and it does actually supply those to other NATO member states as well. So it is like, yes, it really does need to modernize, but it does have a lot of catching up to do, and it's clear that Russia is a part of that in some way.
Although modernizing, requires a degree of technological development that it's just not clear they're capable of doing, which is one of the reasons they're so aggressive about stealing it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I want to ask, sorry, Alicia, go ahead.
No, I was just going to play a speculation game, so go ahead. You probably have a more serious question.
Well, maybe. So maybe not. Let's speculate and find out.
Well, when it comes to North Korea, it's a lot of
it's kind of an inherently
throwing America
speculative
into
question
it.
And this is
as well.
somebody who's very close to the source material, so yeah.
So if you were Kim Jong-un and you had just watched this deployment, which is mostly to the Kursk region in Russia, but a few ended up, on the other side of the border. What would your lesson be about your troops' fighting readiness? They seem to have just walked into a meat grinder that was already killing, and had already killed or maimed 700,000 Russians, and they didn't, as best as I can tell, didn't perform any better or differently. What would your lesson be for combat readiness on the Korean Peninsula?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And I think my initial answer is it really demonstrates how little a dictator like Kim Jong-un gives to the value of life of an individual soldier. I mean, he's knowingly sending in soldiers who are malnourished. We do know that there is a lot of malnourishment among not just the general public, but soldiers in particular. Um, you, he is sending them to this slaughter knowingly for his grand strategic ends. And I think that that's really important. We also have heard that domestically, he is trying to keep knowledge of the very fact of sending soldiers under wraps. So we've heard news of moving families of the soldiers so as to, you know, prevent the spread of knowledge about what is going on. Some of these families don't even know that their sons have been sent to the front lines or to Russia. They don't know that. And so that in itself, I think, speaks volumes about that's not really a lesson that he's really concerned about, maybe. That being said, I think that we also have a lot of the soldiers not being deployed to the front lines, but being in Russia to help train Russian soldiers to use the weapon systems that North Korea is supplying. So we do know that Russia is, in heavy need of basic munitions, right? It doesn't have basic artillery now because it's just been shelling and shelling and shelling. So North Korea has been supplying that, and its systems are distinct from, even though in many cases they're inspired by Soviet, they do have some indigenous systems that they have been training Russian soldiers to use. And so that's also a big part of this question. But certainly at the end of the day, when it comes to an inter-Korean conflict, the long-time narrative among policy watchers of this in DC and elsewhere has been North Korea doesn't have a technological advantage, but it does have sheer numbers. It has a large number of troops when it came compared to South Korea. So North Korea has like a 1 million standing man army or something. I mean, whether those are ready for active duty and not, that's a whole other question. But it has a large force, and so I think the lesson that I'm wondering is that they're thinking back to the original Korean War in the 1950s, which North Korea gained a lot of momentum. Well, not just through North Koreans, but when the Chinese entered the battle, the Chinese basically just sent soldiers after soldiers after soldiers.
Origin of the word human wave attacks.
Yeah. And so I wonder if that's also part of this thinking, is like this outmoded view of what inter-Korean conflict would look like. And so we have these like multiple layers of what war fighting looks like, combined with now this question about a nuclear deterrent / if they are able to develop like a more tactical nuke that they could deploy, for whatever, so we have these multiple logics of war fighting that I think are incommensurate with each other, that really do need some kind of strategic updating. Yeah.
I mean, there's a really interesting relationship between the Korean War and this war. I think, as that one side is doing these human wave attacks. That's why the Russian casualties are so high, and that they are using their own, in North Korea's case, it was, People's Liberation Army draftees, from China. And in Russia's case, it is predominantly, Central Asian non-great Russians, so that they don't have to do conscription in Moscow and St. Petersburg. But in both cases, it's sort of not the ethnic group of the combatant leader, and they're just throwing huge numbers of bodies at lines of of a side that is willing to preserve, much more eager to preserve its own human life, whether it's the Ukrainians now or the uh, South Koreans and Americans then. And there's a sort of a weird, and so you rack up these just immense casualty counts for very, very marginal gains, and or in some cases no gains at all. But I think it's interesting to me in a kind of morbid way that Kim Jong Un looks at this and says, "Oh, I got an idea. Let's get involved in this one,"
Yeah.
because it actually is in his, in his own regime's DNA. Not to mention his family, right? This is his grandfather's war.
Yeah.
And there's just some real thematic similarities. And it's just kind of, I don't know if it means anything, interesting that they showed up for it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting too if we think about how the negotiated settlement is going to happen with Ukraine, right? What's going to happen with Ukraine? How is the territory going to be divided? Is it going to be under whose protection? Which great power sphere of influence? And then if you project it out, right, then you have this group of people, the Ukrainians, fate is decided at the hand of, well, right now it looks like it's going to be just two people, Trump and Putin, right? And that's very also, that rings very true for the continued division of the Korean Peninsula, which is, I think, one of the tragedies of the 20th century is this protracted war that happened because of great power politics. Yeah.
So I'm going to pivot back to the speculative question, but I also have like some other ones that I'll bring up later. Given some of Trump's more erratic behavior, particularly with longstanding allies, we don't need to talk about which ones. Do you think that there might be any pivot on his part relating to South Korea and that stance? The stance that the U.S. has traditionally had?
You mean Trump's vision for its alliances in Asia?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a question I spend a lot of time thinking about, and I've been meeting with a lot of my South Korean colleagues and friends that come through town here in Washington, talking to them about. And I have kind of three theories that I'm working through, and I think we collectively in Washington are working through. The first one is going back to the idea that, I mean, Trump's former national security advisor, John Bolton, said that Trump doesn't believe in alliances, full stop. Right? Or he doesn't understand alliances. I think it was he doesn't believe in them. And I think that we can parse that in a variety of ways. We know that he sees things as transactional. He prefers to work on bilateral basis. So I think that that's one theory that then we can learn from. We could see evidence of it playing out right now that then we can apply to the case of South Korea, mutual defense treaty / our multi-domain alliance that we have with South Korea. The second one is the theory that I've heard is that what's going on in Europe is part of a bigger strategy to draw down our American presence, if not end, in Europe and the Middle East, and put a lot of more resources and strategic attention to the Asia-Pacific theater, or the Indo-Pacific, as it's been called over the past few years. And I've talked to some people that are, either close to or going into the Trump administration, that kind of strategic community, that new Republican, whatever, MAGA strategic outlook. And a lot of them are China hawks. And so I think there is a potential logic to this. And there's, we certainly know that Marco Rubio is a China hawk. A lot of the people that are staffing up the DOD are China hawks.
Although
so,
Marco Rubio,
yeah.
to be fair, is also a Ukraine hawk. And
yeah, that's true.
And that has not helped Ukraine at all in this. And so query whether the price of entering the administration as a hawk is that you sell 100%. Your hawk soul.
Yeah. I mean, we're playing a whole new form of like policy-making politics in Washington right now, where all hail the thief, or all hail the chief. I said it's the Radiohead album,
Freudian slip.
Freudian slip. But anyway, but I do think there's a sense to it, and then what that means for South Korea and Japan are kind of parallel alliances in particular, and the spirit of trilateralism that we've been building over the past, 4 years, is that then it would make a renewed interest in at least on the like defense level, on the military level, of continuing at the current kind of rates, or at least, like kind of playing that out depending on what, China Washington relations are. But then I would say the third one is a slight variation of the Trump doesn't believe in alliances, but he cares about Asia, is the issue this time around with South Korea that's different than his first term. The first time he was really concerned about all allies paying for our military presence, right? We have a really big military presence in South Korea. We have 28,000-ish troops, as well as multiple bases, Air Force, Army, all aimed at a potential inter-Korean conflict and deterring North Korea. That was really a big concern of Trump 1. But this time around, Trump's concern about South Korea is really focused on trade imbalances. And this is, I think, a big part of his kind of more economic policies and how those play into him. So I think that the big thing for South Korea is going to be its trade imbalance. It has a relatively high trade imbalance with with the United States. I mean, and that's something that I know that Trump wants to negotiate. So whether then the defense part of the alliance gets drawn into this trade part of the alliance is probably likely, if we think about the kinds of things that he might want to negotiate. Oh, we give you, these continued troop presences, and you buy, more LNG for us. That's probably what's going to happen with that, is that South Koreans are going to offer to buy more LNG to counteract they need energy. Anyway, so that's kind of a different, like, kind of version. I think that's probably a more likely scenario.
Also curious about how North Koreans leaving the country may change the North Korean information ecosystem. I'm going to back up and explain. In my own research, looking at conflicts, one of the things that seemed to be a precursor, one of many conditions that seemed to be a precursor to a conflict in an information ecosystem, was an opening of that ecosystem, especially if it had been more closed. And as you and I were talking before, the North Koreans had been extremely closed, extremely tight and controlled information ecosystem. Then with economic ties with Russia, you have more North Koreans going out to work in China. And now this movement of troops into Russia, where, if I'm not mistaken, there's been some rumors that some of those guys didn't even know they were going in to fight. It was right. They were being sent for training and then found themselves in the front line. There's veracity to that.
Yeah. I mean, that's the reports I've read.
So what do you think is going to happen now? Because some of these North Koreans will most likely come home. Do you think that it will spell any trouble for the leader?
Yeah, that's a really important question that Kim Jong-un very clearly has it at the top of its mind. I mean, as I mentioned before, he's relocated. But we have information that he's probably relocated family members of these soldiers as a way to kind of tamp down on the sharing of news. But in the lesson that Kim Jong-un is most likely looking at is what happened in the late 1990s through 2000s in North Korea, was a mass exodus of North Koreans to China after what's called the Great Famine, or they call it the arduous march in North Korea. It's very propagandized what we are marching toward, but marching through this period of suffering. So we had this disaster. It was a collapse of the public distribution system, flooding, agricultural, collapsed, and so what happened was just mass starvation, and there was an exodus of hundreds of thousands of North Koreans over 12 whatever year period to China, many of whom landed up in South Korea. And that's where we get a lot of our information about what happens in South Korea. But that phenomenon indelibly impacted the information environment in North Korea. So initially, there was a lot of the leader at the time is Kim Jong-un's father. For a period, he couldn't control the economy, and he couldn't control border security. And there was an indication that he actually let a lot of that cross-border movement happened as a lifeline for just basic subsistence of the North Korean people. And so not all the people just left. A lot of them were coming back and forth like as smugglers for years, like years and years and years. People, they were built up these cross-border networks of trade. And it's not just trade in goods, but trade in information. And so during this period, there's a broad effort on the part of South Korea, the United States, NGOs, church groups to help get information into North Korea. And so this occurred in a variety of ways. It was like smuggling in DVDs, smuggling in the devices to play them on, smuggling in USB drives with Wikipedia pages on like what is democracy. So like just getting basic information and outside news as well as cultural products, which were really impactful. So like we know the Korean wave, the power of K-dramas, like those were impactful for a lot of the North Koreans, especially the younger ones who wanted a better life. So this happened over the period of like 10, 15, 10 years, 12 years. Then the state regained the state capacity to not only off the border, but also maintain state surveillance. And this is really important, I think, for this case, because this is the lesson. What happened is then people left and didn't come back. The world knew. That's how we learned about the massive human rights abuses in North Korea. The Gulag system were these North Korean refugees. Kim Jong-un doesn't want that to happen. And so I think that's why he's being particularly cautious in the number of troops that he's sending, how he's sending them, and likely what's going to happen when they come back. He's not going to reintegrate them into society. He's going to be cordoning them off in order to prevent the flow of information. Because we do also know that we have these like reports from Ukrainian soldiers who have met the North Korean soldiers in Ukraine. They have smartphones now. It's like wild to get a picture in the context of a North Korea, which is like capitalism is the devil, South Korea is the devil, like literally on LG phones or Samsung phones, right? And they're accessing the international internet. So Kim Jong-un is really actively going to be trying to tamp that down. And
So
because of the scale, he will be able to.
Yeah, there is a precedent for this, and it's how Stalin handled Russian soldiers who had had too much contact with the West in Germany. And, basically they were the next wave of purges in the late 40s and early 50s. Like a shocking number of them are sent to the Gulag, killed, and like the only thing worse than being a Russian POW in German camps was being a Russian, sent back from the front after successfully occupying. And this, I don't think the North Koreans, the last thing they're going to be able to do is talk about what they saw.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And Kim Jong-un certainly has the like state surveillance system and the sorts of neighborhood watch groups. That system is well set up that will be able to counteract any of that.
So question, one possibility is that this was a token, one time, 10,000 people, most of them will get killed. I'll take care of the rest when they get back. Gesture for Russian goodwill, trade, etc. Another possibility is that, one thing Kim Jong-un has a lot of is people he can't feed well anyway. And Russia has a manpower issue. It obviously has a production capacity issue, but the biggest issue that it has is a manpower question, and it's actually one of the few politics issues that Putin is still dealing with domestically, which is, which is, by the way, playing out in Ukraine as well, which is that, it is hard to recruit enough people voluntarily, and it is politically unattractive to compel service. So they're doing it. So the rent a North Korean model is actually pretty attractive to Putin, I think. And so, should we understand the 10,000 as a symbolic gesture that, in the grand scheme of things, whether the bodies running into bullets are North Korean or, or Central Asian or Caucasus people is very unimportant from a Ukrainian point of view, except symbolically? Or should we understand it as, what are there, 15, 20 million North Koreans, you could add a lot of manpower if Kim Jong-un were willing to supply large numbers of troops over time.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, at this point, it's hard to talk about. I mean, the conflict in Ukraine right now, the war is, I mean, I have, it's hard to say because I kind of feel like there is a sense of it will be ending, or at least there will be a ceasefire soon with the kinds of rapid fire Trump Putin. I mean, I'm
Yeah,
not a,
don't
you know,
hold
I'm
your
not,
breath on that.
yeah,
I don't
yeah.
think there's going to be a ceasefire soon, but
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, if it does get more protracted, then there is a sense to North Korea as being a longer lifeline. But to go back to what I was saying earlier, these soldiers aren't the best trained. I mean, it's interesting. One of the data points that stuck out to me is that, based on everything I understand about the North Korean military, is they are very good sharpshooters. Like because that's what they're trained to do, right? Like they go to the firing range and that's how they train. But then the other parts of war fighting, they get captured or they get injured and killed because the other parts of war fighting they are less trained for in the kind of modern warfare environment, contemporary warfare environment that the Ukraine battlefield is. And so that's something that I think Kim Jong Un is very well aware that there's a limit to how much he can send, because you don't want to if you send, right now it's maybe the numbers vary, but 1 to 3,000 that were actually deployed on the battlefield. The rest were in Russia for training purposes. And so that's a big difference, right? If you're on the battlefield versus if you're helping train Russian soldiers, that's something that I think is sustainable for North Korea. Because this gets back to Alicia's point about the flow of information. Once you start sending 20,000, 30,000 more soldiers to the battlefield, it'll be hard to contain the information about what's going on there. And there are enough vestiges of social networks. I'm a skeptic about what it means, like a real civil society in North Korea. That's a big debate among the Korean watching community. But the legacies of that period of the Great Famine that I talked about, those interpersonal ties from smuggling and the trust that was built up, there's a lot of still legacy, enduring networks from that. And so if you start sending tens and thousands of troops on the battlefield, that information is going to find its way back, especially because now you do have access to the internet. There are ways to get to smuggle that information into North Korea. So I think that's too big of a threat. But the more likely scenario is if this is protracted, as far as personnel is concerned, is North Korea sending trainers, medical, it is an anemic system, but we've heard that Russian soldiers are reportedly being treated in North Korean facilities. I mean, there's also a question that that's maybe a front for other training, like military training rather than medical treatment. But that sort of, behind the lines training or the behind the lines effort is something that's more likely. And the other thing that's worth mentioning is North Korea actually does have a kind of a guest worker program that it signs with countries like Russia. And the international legal system says it's against the law to have these North Korean soldiers. They don't get their wages. They have to give them to the state. But there are thousands of North Korean workers in things like forestry industry in Russia. And so other forms of workforce aid, I think could be possible. But I think that sort of question all boils down to Alicia's question point about the limiting information flows from the outside because North Korea depends so heavily on such a controlled information environment.
I'm down a rabbit hole where I'm trying to find a Russian song right now that was called Razmuzhensia or something, and it was encouraging people to breed because there was a question in the chat about collapsing demographic rates.
Ooh.
Well,
Yeah.
that was not what I expected you to say. I expected you to burst forth with a fabulous question, not a Russian breeding song. But
pronatalism is strong worldwide. Yeah.
Yeah. But you keep on that and find the song, and we will we will keep going. So I want to ask a little bit about South Korean politics because if there has been anything weirder than US politics over the last 4 months, it has been South Korean politics.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the combination of US transactional weirdness in relation with allies, to which you alluded earlier, and the bizarre uh, events that are still unfolding in South Korea, seems to me to have a lot of possibility for confusion and combustibility and,
Yeah.
just things going off in weird directions. So, what should we understand about what's going on in South Korea, and how and to what extent does that play into any of this?
Yeah. Yeah. There's, I mean, we have like multiple layers of the international game being held. So just to kind of summarize really quickly for the listeners, in December, on December 3rd, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol declared martial law because he felt that he said that the National Assembly was impeding the basic runnings of democracy, and there was a rampant proliferation of impeachments of a lot of officials, which is true. That's true. But the answer that he had was to issue martial law, which was really quite exceptional and kind of came as a surprise to a lot of us. The conservatives in South Korea are the ones that are the most US friendly. They are the ones that are the most anti-North Korea. And so there's a little bit of that language that's being used in it. It's to prevent, communist forces. There is a lot of that. It feels very anachronistic, but that's very much a part of partisan South Korean
It all
politics. So
felt very like 1988 to
yeah.
me.
Yeah. I mean, there's like you can find online, I think Reuters had like timelines of how martial law decrees in this is the first time it's been declared since Korea democratized in 87, 88. And so you can see the timeline comparing this one versus the earlier ones and like how quick it was. So he issued a martial law declaration. He sent out troops to take over the National Assembly, and within 3 hours he rescinded it because people mobilized and supported, protested against it peacefully. So it's really quite remarkable how quickly that happened. It's not just the opposition, the political opposition, but civil society was really quite quick, mobilized through Korea's like really good like information, like social media networks. But what happened since is, he has been impeached in the National Assembly, and we just wrapped up this week. The Korean process is the National Assembly impeached him back in December, and the Constitutional Court needs to review and decide whether it meets the legal conditions of impeachment. So they just wrapped up the final arguments this week, and we can expect a decision in 2 weeks. I think it will be upheld. I think that the case against it generally is understood to be, it's a pretty egregious overstretch of power, and it does not meet the criteria of a national state of emergency, even though it might be politically, expedient way. It's not really, it doesn't meet the legal justification. And Korea is still a procedural democracy, even if it does have a lot of corruption. So that's the other thing that's a little bit different than earlier legal problems of Korean presidents. It's not unremarkable that Korea is a very working procedural democracy, but like every Korean president, except for the most Moon Jae-in, they all have been impeached or in some sort of legal trouble. And it's largely related to some sort of corruption scandal. And so it's a lot going on when it comes to thinking about South Korean politics. I'm a big nerd about it, so I love it. But it has a lot of implications for right now because, in an era where everybody's trying to get on Trump's good side, and especially the state of the South Korean-U.S. alliance depends so much on good leader-level relations. The Koreans want to be able to show a strong front, but, right now they have an acting president. And so it doesn't actually behoove them to do a sort of leader level, high level engagement when they need to get their political house in order. But at the same time, they don't want to wait.
Especially because while lots of Americans were inspired by the civil society uprising and impeachment and the speed of it in Korea, I doubt that President Trump was one of them. I mean,
Right.
Like here you have a guy being kind of Trumpy
Yep.
strongman kind of thing,
Yep.
and gets his ass handed to him within
Yep.
48 hours. And I can't imagine that's an inspiring example
Yeah,
for
and this
Trump
is actually
himself.
super important because Yoon's strategy, Yoon is like kind of styled himself as a political outsider. He was a prosecutor, or not, like a prosecutor that then came into the political realm, and he's been very like bullish in a lot of things. But he's styling himself as like the mobilization for in support of him is actually quite strong because Korean politics, like everywhere, is quite polarized right now. And what's really interesting is last year they had like kind of like a midterm election, and his party lost seats. And there's been now the language around it is that the seats were stolen from him. So you actually see protest signs for those that are still backing this impeached president, stop the steal, like in English and in Korean. And it's clearly trying to be a message of like Trump, come like save us, like we're like you, like it was stolen
It's
from us.
almost
But
it's almost, Alicia, like there's an information ecosystem that's
yeah,
coming.
but it's a terrible strategy because all it shows to Trump is that he's an ineffectual leader who was impeached, that he was a loser, right? To
A
use Trump's
loser.
terms. So that's exactly what I've been like. It's not a good strategy, but that's what they think is going to be. And we know now in January, Trump said something like he doesn't want to deal with North Koreans because look, they got that impeached guy. Like he was very like dismissive about it. So it's really not. Yeah, like the Koreans need to get their house in order and figure out that trade imbalance issue before they do anything. But the problem here is that sequencing, because they need to get to Trump before Kim Jong Un does, and do know that Trump does want a deal with North Korea, whatever that deal is. That's like a whole other fodder
Yeah,
for
there's a whole
discussion.
Riviera thing he wants
Yeah,
to
yeah, yeah,
build in the
exactly. Exactly. But you can see how like contingency, like like process matters in
right.
this case. Right? Is he going to talk to Kim Jong Un first and like basically sell out our 70-year-old alliance, or is he going to work with the South Koreans for a more negotiated settlement? And unlike the first time when he had his period of symmetry during Trump's first term, he doesn't necessarily need the South Korean interlocutor because he already has a personal relationship with Kim Jong Un.
We are
Well, his
going to leave it there because we are out of time. But while we have been talking, I have been informed of scandalous gossip related to the title of this show, which is that not only am I wearing a non-dog shirt, but that Alicia is actually wearing, let's see it, we can't,
A cat
a
shirt?
cat shirt.
Ah!
And uh so there is no dog shirt on this show today, but there is a cat shirt. And I think that's kind of like, if all of us turned out to be North Korean troops, instead of, North American think tank analysts. Um, I apologize. Like, I apologize for Alicia's behavior and for its undisclosed nature.
You
I
should see the
when
songs that have been dropped in the chat with
when
the
I
help
don't
of
wear
a
a dog
husband.
shirt, I explain myself in the monologue at the beginning of the show. I don't just put it in the chyron that I'm secretly wearing a cat shirt. So I want to apologize, and anybody who is watching this who needs a refund for their ticket price should apply to Alicia. I'm sure she will do that. Um, Darcie, so great to meet you. This was fabulous, and come back and join us anytime. The nice thing about the Korean Peninsula is that even when it's out of the news, it shouldn't be. And come back and talk to us again.
About
Happily.
incels and demographics.
Oh, Oh, that's a big, yeah. Happy to talk about that too. Yeah.
We're going to be back, folks, tomorrow. It's going to happen. I don't think we have a guest scheduled for tomorrow, but that's okay. I will be here. Maybe Ev will show up and hack something, or maybe we'll you know, I don't know, talk to uh, somebody else. Who knows? But we're going to be here. Keep the faith. Put holes in your shirts. Have a 35-year-old shirt that doesn't have a cat on it. I mean, Alicia showing up on Dog Shirt TV in a cat shirt, that's just, like hurts. Um, uh, See you tomorrow.